Well, hello. I'm here with Madeleine Drohan. Druhan? How do you pronounce it?
Drohan.
Drohan. Okay, Madeleine. Maybe give us a quick introduction why you approached the History Symposium.
Okay. Well, right now I'm a senior fellow at the Graduate School for Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. But my background is as a journalist. I spent 40 years as a journalist. The last 13 of them, I was with The Economist as their Canada correspondent. But after I finished that, I decided that I wanted to investigate a question that had been bothering me for a while about the origins of Canada. So I went back to school and got my master's degree in history. And actually, my paper forms part of the book that I've written. And I find that this is history that we weren't taught in school. And I wanted to get it to a wider audience. And so I thought the history symposium would be perfect. You've got an informed group that's already there. I hope that I'm telling them something new with this. I guess we'll find out.
Well, it's new to me. And it's funny. I've been certainly heard of Benjamin Franklin, and I always envisioned him more as an inventor. I think that's what seems to populate a lot of the headlines and then but with my interest in Napoleonic history, then I also knew he had an association with France and the revolution. But yeah, this all is a totally new wrinkle. So I'm really fascinated to hear what you have to say about this.
That's great.
All right. Why don't you share your screen? You said you have some slides that help you talk about the background in the book, and we can go through those.
Okay. That's
Perfect.
okay. Shall I just leap in then?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Well, this is the cover of my book. And people keep congratulating me on the timing of it as if I had sort of deliberately written this book to respond to Donald Trump and his claim that Canada should be the 51st state. And actually, that's not the case, although Trump is certainly helping me publicize the book. The idea actually came to me in 2017 when I was on a reporting trip to Montreal. I had some time on my hands and I wandered into the Chateau Ramezay Museum. Now, this is a museum about Quebec history in a building that was built in the early 1700s. And I was surprised to come across there a portrait of Benjamin Franklin. And this is just my picture of it. It's a rather large portrait, and I was thinking, what is Benjamin Franklin doing in a museum about Quebec history? But it had a little plaque beside the portrait that explained that he had come to Montreal in 1776 to try to persuade the French Canadians to join the American Revolution. And he'd actually been in that very building for a reception. Now, I thought, given I'd been writing for The Economist for well over a decade by then, I thought, I was a moderately well-informed person, but I had never heard of Benjamin Franklin being in Montreal. And so that visit led to three questions. I mean, the first was what was he doing in Montreal and what did he do there? But the second was, why don't I know about it? And when I asked other people, they didn't seem to know about it either. And I guess the third one was, is this just ancient history? Or are there lessons from that that apply today? And that's sort of the why should you care bit about this. So the more research I did, the more I realized that Franklin's visit to Montreal was not the only time that he imagined that Canada should be American. I counted and there was 14 times that I could see where he raised this idea in his public writings, sometimes in plans that he put together for the colonial governments. And then later on, when he became more active in trying to accomplish this goal, such as his visit in 1776 to Montreal, and when he was in Paris negotiating the final peace treaty between the United States and Britain that ended the revolution. Now, he was not the only American that coveted Canada, but he was the most famous at the time, and this was because of his experiments with electricity. They were widely published among scientists in France and England and elsewhere in Europe, so he was the best known American of his age. But the other reason to focus on him is that he held positions throughout his life that gave him a platform and sometimes the ability to sort of advance his ideas. He was a printer and a publisher in Philadelphia. He was a politician in the Pennsylvania Assembly. He was a diplomat and a prolific writer in London for decades. He was a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. And then finally, he was a diplomat and the chief negotiator for the Americans in Paris. So I'm not going to go through every twist and turn of these 14 different attempts, but I will try to hit the high points of, what he was doing, why this isn't common knowledge, and why it's relevant to what's happening today. And I'm going to start with two bits of background because listeners or viewers might have already picked up on this. My use of the words Canadians and Americans when neither country existed for most of the time I'm talking about. But I use them because already towards in Franklin's time, that's what they called themselves and they called each other. I mean, just like today, I can say I'm from Ottawa, I'm Ontarian, I'm Canadian. Uh, they had different things, descriptions of themselves, but one of them was American and Canadian. And at the time, these were geographic designations. I am a resident of Canada. They didn't mean the same thing that they do today. They didn't have those political labels attached to them. And I should note, just as part of that, that Canada has existed on European maps since the mid 1500s. This is why the term Canadians, existed for a long time. Okay, my second point that I want to go into, this is a bit longer, is just a brief history of relations between England and France. And England became Britain in 1707. So then Britain and France um, in the period of Franklin's lifetime, because it does put what he was doing, what he was thinking into a broader context. And I guess the key thing to remember is that France and England, and then France and Britain, had been at war on and off for centuries, before Franklin arrived on the scene. And religion was a really important factor. It was Catholic France against Protestant England. I mean, the style of government also came into it because France was an absolute monarchy, whereas England had a monarch, but his powers were constrained by a parliament. And both regarded the other as wrong-headed in this respect. But because they were at war, so were their colonists all over the world. French and English kings made matters worse by granting territory in North America to their subjects without any reference to each other, let alone the indigenous peoples whose land they were giving away. And so what happened there was, they would give these land grants, these charters, and that left the French colonists and the English colonists thinking that they alone had the sole right to this territory. So you can see the potential for conflict from the very beginning. This shows up in maps of the day where the borders are drawn completely differently depending on whether the cartographer was English or French. And just as an example, I'm going to show you two maps from the year 1755, which for those of you interested in the military history, I guess the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, as it was called in North America, was just starting at that time. So this is a map This is the John Mitchell map, actually, and it was drawn by a cartographer who was from the colonies. And you can see, as he's marked out, first of all, the colonies don't seem to have western borders, the ones that are
Hmm.
below the Great Lakes. They just sort of stretch on to eternity, which for them was the Pacific Ocean, although they didn't know very much about, the western interior at the time. And you should also note from this map that Mitchell thought that southern Ontario was actually belonged to the British colonies. It's hard to see, but the word Virginia sort of stretches into southern Ontario. So that is his concept of, who owned what, who controlled what. This is a French map from exactly the same year. This is done by a very famous French cartographer, Belin, and it tells an entirely different story. It's a little hard to see, so I've sort of outlined it. Right there, the cartographer has written Canada below the Great Lakes, right? And he's also very helpfully circled what the French thought was the British territory in North America. So you can see right there the conflict. This is a Dutch map, which the cartographers borrowed from each other. So this would have been based basically on a French map, but it's just a better visualization of where they actually thought Canada or New France, as it was called, would be, and where the British territories were. And up around the bottom of Hudson's Bay, that was Rupert's Land, the territory for the Hudson's Bay Company. Okay. So Franklin was born in 1706, and I'm going to show you a map. This is a French map from 1708. So keep in mind the British colonists wouldn't have agreed with this. But I think it's helpful because it sort of shows where the population was concentrated. So in that green bit where the British colonies were, that's where the bulk of the British population was. And then north of the St. Lawrence River, between basically Montreal and Quebec, that's where the bulk of the French Canadian population was. And where they rubbed up against each other, in northern New York State and sort of south of the St. Lawrence, that's where there was a lot of conflict at the time that Franklin was born. And there were raids and counter raids on settlements, and the British and the French, with their indigenous allies, would go in and sort of burn houses and kill people and take hostages. That was a big thing. They'd take hostages either to keep them for work or to trade for ransom later on. So that was really a live issue at the time. And the point of that is that Franklin would have grown up seeing Canada as a threat, the threat from the North. So the security issue was in his mind from the very beginning. And he wouldn't have been the only person in the British colonies at the time who thought the solution would be take over Canada and get rid of the French. So I took a look at his public writings, certainly not all of them. The man was a prolific writer, as I said. But the first written evidence that I saw of his interest, where he's actually stated his interest in sort of controlling the northern part of the continent, was in a 1751 essay he wrote. And it was really just about population growth, the booming population growth in the British colonies. But in it, he suggested it was the destiny of the British American colonists to basically occupy the entire continent. Now, this is almost a century before the term manifest destiny became common, but it's the same idea. From then on, from 1751 on, The idea popped up again and again in his writings, in his pamphlets, in his essays, in various proposals he had for the colonies to join together for common security. And it looked like his dream was about to be realized in 1760, at the end of the Seven Years' War, when Britain, with the aid of soldiers from the colonies, pushed the French out of Canada or New France. But then a debate arose in Britain. This was a time when after a war, the warring parties would negotiate and sort of do a bit of horse trading about who keeps what of what they conquered. And the debate that arose in Britain was, should Britain keep Canada or should it keep Guadeloupe? Now, today, that seems like a fairly unequal proposition, but at the time, Guadeloupe produced a lot of sugar and a lot of money for whichever imperial power controlled it. Meanwhile, Canada had been a drain on France, and it looked like it was going to be a drain on Britain as well. So Franklin, by this time, had been sent to London to represent the interests of some of the colonies. And he had lots of friends among the printers and publishers from his day as a printer and publisher in the colonies. So he wrote a pamphlet, it's called the Canada Pamphlet, although it's got a much longer name as well. But anyhow, he weighed in on the side of Britain should keep Canada. And he laid out his reasons for that. First of all, it would remove the security threat from the 13 colonies, but also it would give American settlers room to expand. So that's how he viewed it. Britain would take over Canada. The American colonists could expand into Canada. It would become an American colony like all the other British American colonies. There was one slight problem, is that it was currently inhabited by French Canadians, but Franklin thought they should either be encouraged to leave or assimilated so that they became English-speaking Protestants. So that was his over this period of his writing, he was sort of building this intellectual case for why, in fact, Canada should be American. Now, Britain decided to keep Canada as a colony. This is what the French Canadians called the conquest, and I will come back to that at some point. But it also caused a great deal of confusion by redrawing lines about this new entity that it called the province of Quebec. Now, this is a map from a British map that supposedly shows what those peace terms translated to in North America. And it's hard to see the bit that they called the province of Quebec there. I've outlined it there. So you can see, keep in mind, those other maps showed this vast space occupied by Canada and New France, and all of a sudden Britain's saying, oh, this is the province of Quebec. And the rest of it was sort of a little vague about what this other territory was. It's written on this map, land reserves reserved for Indians. But it was clear that it thought that the western border of the American colonies was down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. So, so Franklin's happiness and that of the other American colonists who feared the threat from the north didn't last very long. There were already tensions between Britain and her American colonies at the time of the conquest. And they built up steadily through the 1760s as Britain tried to impose taxes on the colonists, in part to pay down the debts that came from the war that they had just won. The Boston Tea Party, just to situate this for people, was in, I think, December 1773. And in 1774, Britain began passing, punitive legislation targeting the rebellious colonies. But in the midst of this, Britain also passed something called the Quebec Act. It was not one of the coercive or intolerable acts that we hear about, but because of its timing, the Quebec Act was seen in the American colonies as part of Britain's efforts to punish them. And it certainly contained measures that angered the colonists. So this is not a historic map, but it was the best I could find to show what the boundaries were supposed to look like after the Quebec Act of 1774. And you can see that the province of Quebec or Canada is now being extended down at least partway to where New France used to be. It basically goes to the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. And the colonies are still constrained by the Appalachian Mountains. And there's this sort of vague territory in there called Indian country on this map, but it relates to land reserves for indigenous peoples. But what this did for in the colonists' mind was it made clear that Britain saw that interior territory below the Great Lakes as part of Canada or the province of Quebec. And this enraged the colonists for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, there was the religious factor, because the Quebec Act allowed the French Canadians to continue practicing Catholicism, which in the colonies was called popery and was seen as something close to devil worship. But it also enraged the land speculators, including Franklin. Many of the founding fathers were land speculators because it was closing off the land to them that they had planned on settling for a profit. And there were already some American settlements that were being built there. So this is a map just to give you an idea of what some of the land speculation proposals were. Vandalia was proposed in 1769, and Franklin was involved in that. Transylvania was 1775, he wasn't. And that huge one, Charlatania, was proposed in 1763. It was probably the least serious of the proposals. But you can see they had their eye on that land that Britain was now saying is part of Canada, not part of the colonies. Okay. So in 1774, the American colonists set up what they called the Continental Congress. And I love that name because to me, it's sort of a clue to their aspirations. And the whole idea of the Congress was for the colonies to get together and decide how should we deal with Britain. But in that, as part of that Congress, the delegates also wrote a letter to the inhabitants of Canada inviting them to join the rebellion against the British government and to free themselves from British tyranny. It's a great letter, actually. You can find it online and it's well worth reading. The Canadians, the French Canadians, didn't reply. Oh, the letter was translated into French, but the French Canadians didn't reply. So in June 1775, the Continental Congress decided that they would invade Canada. Now, they thought it would be an easy conquest because they believed, based on bad intelligence, that the French Canadians were secretly on their side. And there were about 100,000, give or take, there's no great estimates here, of French Canadians at that time. There were maybe about 2,000 English speakers in Canada at that time. A lot of them were merchants that came up after the end of the 7 Years' War, thinking that Canada was going to be like an American colony and they could do business there. And there were about 2.5 million American colonists. So, this asymmetry in population is nothing new. It's been there from the very beginning. Okay, so the invasion routes. The invasion began in September, 250 years ago, right now. And it took place in two parts. The one part went up Lake Champlain, and that was led by Richard Montgomery. There were about maybe 1,700 colonial troops that he led up there. They got held up at Fort Saint Jean, which is identified as St. John's on this map, for well over a month by some unexpected resistance, both by British regulars, but also they were joined by some Canadians and some Indigenous allies. Uh, Both the Canadians and the Indigenous allies also supported uh, the invading troops at different points as well, but that might be making things too complicated. Anyhow, one group went up Lake Champlain, got held up at Saint Jean, but eventually got to Montreal, took Montreal, then turned right to go along the St. Lawrence River. They took Trois-Rivières, which isn't on this map, but it's about halfway between Montreal and Quebec. And then they arrived on the outskirts of Quebec City at the beginning of December. The other group, led by Benedict Arnold, went up the Kennebec River, went overland, and then down the Chaudière River to meet up with this group again outside of Quebec City. And Quebec City at the time was the most important city in Canada because it was the seat of the British government. Now, they had to attack. Time was sort of running out for them, mostly because the colonial soldiers had enlisted for a limited period of time, and a lot of enlistments were going to end on January 1st. So that meant that these massed colonial troops, there might have been about 3,000 of them, had to attack Quebec City on December 31st, 1775, in the midst of a snowstorm. The attack failed. General Montgomery, who's in this fairly famous painting, was killed outside of the walls of Quebec. The painting sort of is fairly imaginative because, in fact, he was killed in the midst of a snowstorm. They were walking single file down a very narrow alleyway, and they came across a British Canadian position and were blasted with grape shot. So Montgomery probably didn't look like this, but
Hmm.
this is the romantic image of it. Benedict Arnold was wounded in the leg, I think, and so he taken off the field as well, and his troops were also defeated. The people who held Quebec City were a combination of British regulars, British sailors, French Canadians, English Canadians, and some Indigenous allies. And they all banded together to defend Quebec City. Okay, so the attack failed, but actually the American troops hung on throughout what was a brutal Quebec winter. But at this point, the invasion really started to falter because the American army was low on money, so they could no longer purchase what they needed from the French Canadians. They were also riven with smallpox. And in fact, there was a conspiracy theory that circulated at the time that the British governor of Canada, Guy Carleton, had deliberately sent an infected prostitute out among the Americans to achieve this aim. Yeah.
A
And
busy girl.
yeah. Yes, that was never proven. And the French Canadians, who had those who had been sort of initially neutral or welcoming to the American troops, turned hostile when the Americans couldn't pay anymore for the food and supplies they needed and started to seize them. So Franklin had long been a sort of Mr. Fix-It on the political front. When there were problems that arose, like, I don't know, getting cannons for Pennsylvania during the 7 Years' War, or just sort of setting up a militia in Pennsylvania, he was often the person who was called on to lead a commission and sort out the problem, which he did very well. So it made sense for the Continental Congress to ask him to lead a delegation of two other commissioners, go to Montreal and try to salvage the invasion. So that was what brought him to Montreal in the first place. But by the
But
time these,
sorry to intervene,
no,
but all fascinating. But why Montreal when Quebec was the seat of government?
I think that I mentioned before about the bad intelligence that, in fact, they were getting. And
Yes.
Montreal was a place where a number of formerly American merchants had congregated. It was at the time sort of the city of business, whereas Quebec was the city of government. Pretty much the same thing today. And so these American sympathizers were grouped in Montreal. There were more of them there, and so it made sense for Franklin to go there first because that's where they were told that they actually, first of all, they had the support of these merchants, but also that's where they were told that the French Canadians would be welcoming.
And
So that made sense.
presumably the Americans had control of Montreal. That was their invasion route, right?
Yes,
Up to Montreal
yes.
and then down to Quebec. So, yeah.
That's another very good reason to go to Montreal. The Americans had occupied it and were in control. And it's also easier to get to than Quebec City. You know, if you're coming up Lake Champlain, you hit Montreal long before you hit Quebec City.
Yeah.
So there were a
Okay.
number of reasons, you know. Yeah, but by the time the three of them reached Montreal, which was the end of April 1776, it was much too late. You know, they did what they could to repair relationships with some of the important fur traders, the French Canadian fur traders, but they quickly realized that the American army had already gone into significant debt, something like 20,000 pounds at that time, and that the situation with food was getting fairly desperate. The three of them wrote letters, almost daily begging letters back to the Continental Congress, you know, asking for money. And one of my favorites has a line in it that says, "For God's sake, send powder and pork." And they repeat that quite a bit. British warships were seen on the St. Lawrence at the beginning of May, so only a couple of days after, less than a week after Franklin and his party had arrived, and that the warships were carrying reinforcements, and that basically signaled the end of the invasion. And Franklin and the American army made a dash for the border and to get home again. So that was a humiliating failure in terms of Franklin's desire to possess Canada. But he made one last attempt. And that's when he was chief negotiator in Paris. And he portrayed the British as the aggressors in the conflict with the American colonies. And the Americans were the victims, and they were entitled to compensation. And the compensation he had in mind was Canada. He asked the British to give the United States Canada. That was going to be the compensation for damage that British troops had done during the war in the colonies. But when the Britons said, "What about all the damage done to the Loyalists and their properties?" Um, he wouldn't hear about it. And he raised it like quite a few times with the British negotiator, but he fell ill just towards the end of the negotiations, and his fellow negotiators, John Adams and John Jay, weren't as interested in Canada at that point as Franklin was. They were more interested in getting a secure access to that territory below the Great Lakes. They wanted it acknowledged as American territory, and also they wanted the fish, access to the fish off the East Coast. So that, in fact, is what ended up being agreed in the end. So this is a map of basically showing what was agreed in 1783. And the borders look pretty much like the borders we have today. There's a bit of a vague line where Maine ends, but otherwise that's pretty much what we have. And you'll notice that big chunk below the Great Lakes that both Britain and France thought belonged to Canada was given to the newly founded United States. In fact, the French foreign minister was aghast at this. He said something at the time about Britain had bought the peace with the Americans. And of course, the reason was Britain wanted to continue trade relations with the Americans, so they were quite open to giving the Americans what they wanted, as long as that American market would be open to British traders. Okay. So why isn't this common knowledge? You know, because there are lots of original documents about it, but it just seems to fade into the background. This, to me, was a foundational moment for Canada. Not the only one, but had Franklin been able to turn the invasion around and the Americans held on to Canada at that point, or had he succeeded in Paris and he persuaded Britain to give Canada to the United States, there would not have been any British colonies to confederate in 1867. Yet the majority of people that I mentioned this to don't really haven't heard of that invasion of 1775, 76, nor of Franklin's extended interest in possessing Canada. Okay, there's a number of reasons for that. Franklin didn't talk about it. Those letters I mentioned from the commissioners when he was in Montreal, for example, they were the only correspondence that is existing now that has Franklin's name on it for the whole time that he was in Canada, which wasn't long. It was something like 11 days. But this was a time when people dashed off, letters every night, many letters, and there are none of them that exist today from Franklin. And that leaves historians very little to work with. And that also translates then into popular culture, because if there are not history books written about it and that, it doesn't sort of get passed down into popular culture like movies or documentaries. And Franklin, even after all of this, in his later years when he was in Paris, he only mentioned Canada a few times in passing. So this idea that he had, he seemed either to forget about it or certainly not to want to talk about it. But the Americans don't like to talk about the invasion either, more generally, because launching a military attack on a neighboring colony did not fit with the founding myth of the Americans being rising up against British tyranny and fighting off this tyranny, and that they were the victims. It just didn't go well with that whole idea of being victims when, in this case, in the case of the invasion, it was the aggressors. And because Canadians consume so much American culture, we're influenced by their views, especially when it comes to the invasion, but also in biographies of Franklin, Canada, if they're written by an American biographer, which most of them are, Canada doesn't sort of occupy much space in that biography, if at all. And I will be very surprised if the celebrations in the United States next year for the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence say much about what they were doing in Canada right before they declared independence. But we don't talk about it either, because the French Canadians see other events as much more consequential to them than this invasion, for example. The conquest is sort of the milestone they look at in that particular time period. Because no matter who would have won that invasion, the French Canadians would still have been governed by English-speaking foreigners. So it doesn't really have a lot of prominence in French Canadian history. English Canadians don't talk about it a lot because there were so few of them in Canada at the time. I mean, the Loyalists came after this, and the English Canadians tend to focus on the War of 1812. because that's the one they were around to participate in. And there's also political sensitivities that have an impact. Canada's lived alongside this more powerful, more populous, richer neighbor for a long time. And you don't really want to poke the tiger next door by reminding them that despite the best efforts of their most prominent statesmen at the time, they did not win Canada in 1775, 76. And there's another thing too, that for an event to be cemented in collective memory, somebody has to actually embrace it and publicize it and popularize it, sort of like what Prime Minister Harper did with the War of 1812. But no one seems to have done that with, and here I'm focusing again just on the invasion. No one has done that with the invasion for well over 100 years. And so that's another reason why it sort of slides out of our collective memory of, how we came to be and who we are today. And just as an example of how memory fades so quickly, in 1976, the Canadian Post Office decided to bring out a stamp to sort of jointly with the United States to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And they chose Franklin for the stamp. You know, he was no friend of Canada, and yet here we are commemorating them. And they did it again in 2013. This one was to celebrate 250 years of postal history. Franklin had been Deputy Postmaster General of British North America for about 20 years, ending just when the revolution started to go. So, in terms of postal history, yes, he's worth commemorating, but really not in terms of Canadian history. And that, by the way, I think is Quebec in the background, which sort of rubs salt into the wound.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, last bit, and I'll shorten this. Why should we care? Or what does these events tell us about today? Well, all of us have grown up during a period where relations between Canada and the US were peaceful, even friendly. And we think of that as the norm, and that the current sort of aggressive remarks by the US president are an aberration. But if you actually step back and take a look at the broader sweep of history of those relations, you see that they were hostile between the residents of Canada and the residents of what's now the United States for a couple of hundred years before they warmed up and became friendly. Both they went from being hostile to being sort of wary, and both countries had invasion plans until just before the Second World War. And I have heard that the Canadian government is again looking at such scenarios. So that great friendship that John F. Kennedy talked about and whose quote is repeated ad nauseum is really a relatively recent phenomena. Canadians have forgotten as well, or some Canadians, I shouldn't speak for all Canadians, that the Americans have a long history of expansionism. They went as far west as they could go, and then they turned north and south. Uh, this is a map just showing it. Sadly, it doesn't show the original 13 states because they'd be a tiny strip on the 13 colonies. They'd be a tiny
Yeah.
strip along the Atlantic Ocean. But you can see by 1783, they'd gone west to the Mississippi River, and then the Louisiana Purchase, and the Mexican Cession, and the Texas annexation. So they basically built the United States by either buying or taking over the territory right to the Pacific Ocean. And I mentioned about looking north. For a long period of time, there was this area called the Oregon Country, or Oregon Territory, I think, that was jointly controlled by Britain and the United States. And at one point, there was a move in the United States to actually take that over completely up to the bottom of Alaska, which was the 5440. I think that probably rings a bell for some people. Um, in the end, that didn't happen. And I will get to that in one more second. But if we hadn't pushed these previous hostile relations, history of expansionism with the United States, I think that we'd see that the threats that Donald Trump is making now of making Canada the 51st state are not something completely new. Rather, they're an echo or even a continuation of earlier attitudes. And that should change the way Canada deals with the US president now. Now, would the Americans invade again? I mean, I don't know. I heard a historian say recently that history may not repeat itself, but it does lay out future possibilities. And so I think we have to think of that as just one of many future possibilities. Couple of lessons, and then I'll wind up here. There are lessons for why the Americans did not conquer Canada in the past, despite being more numerous, better armed, and richer. And there's sort of two big ones that I just want to highlight. And one is that a stronger power had Canada's back. You know, first it was France, then it was Britain during colonial times, and then we switched over to the United States. And having that stronger power behind us, it either drove back or deterred would-be aggressors most of the time. 1760 is the exception here. And in the case of the two wars that Canadians with the British fought with the Americans, 1775 and 1812, the stronger power, Britain, was the deciding factor. And we have to ask ourselves, well, who has our back now, and what should we do about it if there is a conflict with the United States? And the second big lesson from all of this that I wanted to highlight was that sometimes the reasons that the Americans actually didn't succeed was that they were distracted by other priorities. For example, in the war that I talked a lot about, 1775, 76, they were also fighting the British Army around Boston and New York and elsewhere in the 13 colonies. And really, that was their priority. They wanted to, safeguard their homes and their friends and their families before they wanted that much more than they wanted to conquer Canada. And so, a lot of, in terms of the military, a lot of troops, equipment, things like winter clothing, even that were meant for Canada, got diverted to the soldiers who were fighting closer to home. Okay, so that was the two things that I think have relevance to today about this past history. We could go on to talk about the War of 1812, but I won't go there right now. Yeah.
I think our audience is well versed in that. That's kind of an area of focus for us. So,
Right. Okay, then I won't go into that. So the story of Franklin's failures matters today because it shows that Canada isn't confronting a new problem, but rather one that has existed since the birth of the United States, at least, if not longer. And in that way, Franklin and the like-minded people of his time sort of set the stage for Donald Trump. I went to hear the US ambassador to Canada speak in September, and I gave him a copy of my book. It was a bit cheeky, but I thought, this is history he probably doesn't know and is worth knowing. Anyhow, he looked at the title and he sort of harumphed because the title is He Did Not Conquer. And he said, you guys were doing elbows up 250 years ago. some things never change. And all I can say to that is, I hope not.
Perfect.
Thank you.
All right. Why don't you stop sharing, Madeline, and we'll wrap up. I made a note of a couple questions, so
Okay.
all quite fascinating. I don't know, maybe in our circles, when we're more of a focus on military history, people are more familiar with the attempted invasion of Quebec. I'm certainly aware of that. I've stood beside the marker just inside the old city gate on the Grand Allée where, they marked Montgomery's death, and then down in lower Old City, identified the area where the barricade was, where Arnold was repulsed in his attack. But what I didn't know about was Franklin's mission to Montreal. So
Oh,
that's quite incredible. You mentioned negotiations with Britain and John Jay. I guess ultimately the treaty ended up being named for him, right? Jay's
yeah,
Treaty, which sort of cemented the borders. So.
yeah,
And you had a lot of maps, and just an aside, but
yeah.
it always strikes me how pretty accurate they are. Like especially the Eastern Seaboard and where the shape and position of the Great Lakes. Like this was pretty rudimentary tools, that they were surveying with and trying to draw maps from. It's quite remarkable what they did without satellites or airplanes or other ways to try to figure this all out, right?
Yeah, no, that's true. They did have one slip up though, in that 1783 treaty where they thought the source of the Mississippi was somewhere where it wasn't. And so there was all sorts of problems trying to figure out exactly where that border was, up around Lake of the Woods and that. But I think they got there in the end, although if you look on the map, it's a pretty weird looking line around there.
I will give them that. Uh, Question for you. I'll quit editorializing. I think you talked about the Continental Congress and a letter to the French Canadians, but who would respond? Like you said, there was no response. Like, was there anything that was like a Canadian government, or it would be the church, I think. Would
Yeah, well, this is part of the problem. There wasn't it was the British government still in the colony, but the way that Quebec society was set up at the time, of course, the clergy were very powerful, and there were the seigneurs who were less powerful but big landowners, and the clergy were opposed to the Americans from the start, and they were very active in telling their parishioners that their loyalty was to the British king and that they should not listen to any of the things that they were being told, because there was a lot of American propaganda circulating. So, with the clergy against them, I mean, they would have been one group that perhaps could have responded uh, uh, with some authority. And of course, they responded in that they basically uh, did not allow a response to the Continental Congress. But the clergy and the seniors were quite happy after the Quebec Act. They got what they wanted. And there wasn't any sort of lower body of government because the immigrants from the American colonies had actually kept pressing the British government to set up a legislative assembly similar to the assemblies that were in the American colonies. The problem was that this tiny minority of English speakers didn't want French Canadians to have seats in the assembly. And Britain realized that you could not govern 100,000 French Canadians by allowing this small group of about 2,000 people to actually be the assembly people.
Yeah, and considering military history, it's not surprising, what Carleton gave in the Quebec Act, because you could otherwise have to commit thousands of troops to occupy Quebec, right? Instead, you negotiate a settlement and give these guys a sense of self-government or being able to manage themselves. Like, what tremendous wins to preserve the Catholic religion when it was basically illegal in Britain, and
Mhm.
then also preserve their culture, which in my mind, it always struck me. That's why Quebec is the unique, special place that it is today. Because you said assimilation earlier. If the Americans had been successful, then I think it would be an entirely different Quebec.
Absolutely. And the French Canadians feared that at the time. I mean, they did talk about assimilation and worried about it. So, one thing I didn't say is that the French Canadians, as a group, and these are estimates, maybe a third of them sort of definitely fought for the British. A third of them were supportive of the Americans, mostly by selling them things or supplying things, but some actually fought. And then another third were in the middle. They were neutral. They were waiting to see which way the wind was going to blow. And strangely enough, those same proportions are sort of what happened in the American colonies. A third were for independence, a third were against, and a third were in the middle. So.
All right, and I'm kind of working backwards with my questions. I guess I should have been more methodical. You talked about Franklin's Canada pamphlet.
Mhm.
Is that available online? Can people find that or?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was widely published, and I think there are still some original copies, but you can definitely find sort of the wording of it online. It's there. And if they're sort of Googling it, it's Canada pamphlet, because I think the long title starts with something in the interests of Britain considered. It doesn't make much sense if you're Googling it. Just look for Canada pamphlet.
All right. I'll look for that and put a link to that in the talk description on YouTube. And then also I'll link your website. Your book, it's out now. It's
Yep. It came out on September 30th.
excellent. Well,
Yeah.
be sure to put a link for that as well. So thank you
Oh,
for this. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm glad you reached out to us and we had a chance to set this up.
well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it too.
All right.